Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. My guest this time is Brendan McNally, a US journalist and former Prague resident. Brendan is the author of Traitor's Odyssey, a book about Martha Dodd, an American spy for the Soviet Union who spent her final decades here in Prague. What's more, Brendan first heard of the story of Martha Dodd from a woman who worked for Radio Prague International in the depths of the Cold War era, as Brendan McNally explains now in this edition of Prague Talk. I'd like to begin by asking you about Martha Dodd's pre-Prague years. I guess she first made a mark when she arrived in Berlin in the 30s as the daughter of the then new US ambassador.
Yes, she accompanied her father along with her brother. The family was very close, very tightly knit, and they had a lot of adventures growing up. The father wanted to bring his kids along for a last adventure together as a family. They were already in their late 20s, the kids were. In Berlin, she immediately started having affairs with top Nazis. Socially speaking, the Dodds were nobodies in Chicago, and Martha absolutely loved all the engraved, invitations she got every day and going out with guys with, Vons in their name. So she just went nuts, and she did what she did best. She slept around an incredible amount, alienated everybody at the embassy, basically, very quickly. And the Nazis all loved her. She was one of them. It went very well.
But speaking of the Nazis, how did she view what was happening in Germany at that time? Because she must have seen what was being done to the Jews in those years.
She saw it. She just didn't care. The family, being nice American middle class, were fairly anti-Semitic to begin with. The father was quite anti-Semitic, and she picked it up from him. She was indifferent. She could not care less what was happening to the Jews, put very simply. And then somewhere along the line, something changed. And that's the big mystery about her is, when did it happen? And nobody can really agree when that happened. All they know is when she came back from a vacation trip to Russia, she had sworn in and signed in as a agent of the KGB, or the NKVD as it was then.
But just to digress for a second, as well as having these lovers who were top Nazis, she also was introduced to Hitler with a view to her and Hitler maybe hooking up.
Hutzi Hanfstaengl believed what Hitler needed was to have an American wife to become more acceptable to the world. And he thought Martha would be absolutely perfect since she was good looking and literate and social and vivacious. And he set up a little tea date at the Kaiserhof, and it went nowhere. It lasted 15, 20, 30 minutes, and it was just...
Well, she simply found Hitler unattractive.
Found him unattractive. He had bad breath, bad teeth. She didn't find anything attractive about him at all, though she thought his eyes were magnetic.
Well, you mentioned the fact that she went over to the Russian side. I guess a turning point in her life was when in Berlin she also started an affair with a Soviet spy called Boris Vinogradov, and he, if I understand it right, recruited her.
He recruited her. He was the press secretary at the Russian embassy. He was dashing, a lot of fun. He was also basically they call her Romeo, a spy whose job was to seduce wives and girlfriends of top diplomats and other people. And he was apparently quite successful at it. Martha just went head over heels for Boris. They had a crazy relationship because they were crazy in love and fighting and making love and fighting more and making up and fighting. It never stopped with these two. And at one point, Moscow Center actually sent both of them warnings to just knock it off, stop doing this. And he was moved to Bucharest and then later to Warsaw, and she kept visiting him when they were away from each other. She had all the affairs she wanted, she could handle, most notably with the head of French intelligence in Berlin. She just couldn't stop.
I guess my biggest question with regards to this part of her life is, why did she go over to the Soviets? Was she motivated by ideology, by love, by money, or some other reason?
She was motivated primarily by love for Boris. She went to Russia for a month-long vacation in the summer of 1934. And what she saw there actually horrified her. It was such a god-awful mess, and she and Boris fought about it quite a bit afterwards. He took her into Moscow Center for her recruitment. She had her discussions with them, and he promptly bailed. And she was PO'd that she had to spend the rest of this stupid vacation on this riverboat with a bunch of boring people.
So why then did she serve the other side in this way for so much of her life?
She turned against fascism at the behest of both Boris and this woman she knew in Berlin named Mildred Fish von Harnack, who was an academic at the University of Berlin. She was from Madison, Wisconsin, taught American literature. She was everything Martha was not. She seemed to be a monogamous woman, tall, tubercular, incredibly educated. She was a woman of deep conviction, and she talked Martha probably more than anyone against fascism and to see and understand what was happening to the Jews and why it mattered. I think she probably played a very, very big role. And I think what it really came down to is in a war, you pick your side and you stick with it. You can't go around switching. Martha picked her side, and that was it. She became ideologically communist in time, or while she was in Berlin. Some of the Moscow Center files talk about her studying Lenin. Mildred turned her against it. I think that's really what it was. And Martha just stuck to one side. She signed on to Moscow, and she stayed that way.
And it didn't change also after the war when she went back to the US and married a rich man called Alfred Stern, who she in turn brought over to the Soviets.
He was already a red millionaire, but she made him actually he asked to sign on into the spy service. So he saw himself as a man of action when he found out that his girlfriend/wife was an actual agent. He wanted in on that. And she spent basically years doing very little during the entire war. About all she did was keep lambasting Moscow Center to give her husband an important job.
But the couple were being monitored by US law enforcement. In the mid-50s, they were subpoenaed, but then they fled to Prague, where they spent most of the rest of their lives. But somehow they were unimpressed by Prague when they initially arrived.
I don't know why. They did not like it at all. I think she felt Prague was too minor a place and that she really deserved a bigger, more important city. She wanted Moscow. Without Moscow, she'd go for Beijing.
But both countries refused.
Both countries refused her. They let them visit, but the Russians did not want her in there. I don't know why she didn't like Prague. I think all their attempts to make friends among the artistic literary communities of Prague went nowhere. People were just too scared. She arrived in 1957, I think. And, the show trials were really not that over. Nobody's going to stick their neck out for some weird Americans. So they made no friends, it sounds like. A colleague of mine, a Dutch colleague, says that they were involved in the Prague orgy scene at some point, but I don't know any of the details. They had no friends. The only friends were, what's his name, Jerzy Hayek, a deputy foreign minister. They would call him when their toilet was clogged. He was their one friend. They had some connections with the American exile community, but it never really worked because they were rich and all the exiles were poor.
When all this came out in the US that she was a Soviet spy and she fled to Prague, how well known was she in America? For example, I came across one tabloid article headlined, "The Spy Queen was a nympho." I mean, was she a kind of tabloid staple, or was she well known?
No. Well, she was a well enough known public figure at the time, starting in the 30s. So she had a reputation, but she was always kind of minor. She was always, second tier at best. And at the time she was uncovered, the Red Scare had already crested and was starting to recede. So her timing in that sense was bad. But she was just among a crowd of all these other people, the Hollywood 10 leftist screenwriters. So she was one of a crowd, and she didn't stand out that much. And the FBI tried to make a big deal of her, and it worked for a while, but it just, I mean, that's the funny thing about Martha is being a spy like that. You'd think she would have some legs, as they say in show business, but she didn't.
This leads me, Brendan, to my next question, which is how did you come across the story of Martha Stern?
It was my first summer in Prague in 92. I was working at the famous Prague Post, and there was a woman working there who was head of research, which meant she was in charge of all the translators, all the translation staff, which were all a bunch of kids. And she was an old, middle-aged, younger than I am now, Sudeten Jew from Ústí nad Labem, whose family had fled to England during the war. They came back after the war. She became an announcer for Radio Prague at an extremely early age because her English was so good. She kept her head down for all these years. Anyway, one day, there weren't any translators around. None of the kids were around. So she went out with me to interview a guy. After that, I noticed the McDonald's had just opened up on Wenceslas Square at the bottom of Wenceslas. And I said, being wanted to be like Mr. Big Shot American, like, with, the largesse. I come on, Dora, let me buy you a Big Mac menu. And she understood my whimsy. And we sat there and had a Big Mac outside the McDonald's. And she asked me, like, have you ever heard of Martha Dodd? I said, no. Who's she? It turned out Dora Slaba had worked for her for less than 2 years, right in the late 80s. She'd seen the job ad posted in Mlada Fronta Dnes for a English-speaking secretary. She went to work for her. The woman paid an enormous amount of money. And for a while, Dora was in heaven. And then she realized the old woman was a nasty old lady. She was self-centered, unpleasant, sick all the time, always complaining, lonely, bored, tired. It got nasty. And the funny thing was she had almost no friends except for the ones that she could buy that would show up. But one woman who did show up was Rita Klimova, who she'd become friends with. I am not sure how, and I'm not sure when. It was probably in the 1960s at some point. Both of them being like fallen away Stalinists. They had a lot to talk about it, and I think Rita Klimova brought her around to appreciating the Czech country and the Czech anti-communist movement. And at some point, she became a patron of the Charter 77 people. And at one point, I think it was March 1989, I'm not really sure when, she ordered Dora to go to a demonstration and check it out and report back what she saw. And Dora didn't want to go, and she had to go. She was driven by the chauffeur who was, an STB guy. And she watched this demonstration, and he immediately brought her up to the STB crowd that were going to bust up the demonstration in a couple minutes. And she realized these were the guys who'd been guarding the house, parked outside the house, the whole time she was there. And they all knew her. They all thought she was STB herself.
Just to interject for a second, I should point out, I also interviewed this woman you're speaking about, Dora Slaba, about almost 20 years ago. And as you say, she worked here for Radio Prague International before it was called Radio Prague International and the Prague Post and so on. Very interesting lady. But one thing I'm interested about, you say that Martha Dodd went over to the Czech descent, or at least she was helping them out in secret. But initially, she and her husband were against the Prague Spring when it happened because they were so communist.
They hated it. Yeah, they had just come in from Moscow. They had been living in Cuba for much of the 60s. And in 67, I guess it was, or early 68, they left Cuba, flew back to Prague where they had a house in Prague 5. They were in Moscow first, and Moscow this time absolutely revolted them, how the whole communist revolution had just turned to garbage. They were absolutely disgusted by what they saw and who they met and the way everybody treated them. And everybody was out for money. They couldn't stand it. So they went to Prague the Prague Spring was just starting and they didn't like it either, but somewhere along the line, they were kind of turned around on it. It might have been by Rita Klimova. I don't really know. So they felt favorably towards it by the time the Russians came in with the tanks. But at the same time, they were so in their little world, their own little universe, that they didn't even know about the invasion until later that day. Their adopted son called them from Mexico City and told them, like, what's going on? Have you seen all the tanks? And, huh? What tanks? And they opened up the windows and they could hear rumbling of tank treads. They thought what the Czechs were doing during the Prague Spring was just initially disgusting, and just a bunch of drunken people having sex everywhere, and bell bottoms and blue jeans and Beatles. They just hated it. Something changed, and they turned around on that somewhat.
Just to rewind for a second, you mentioned Rita Klimova. She is a remarkable character in her own right. She was a former communist, as you say, who had lived in the US during the war and became active in the Czechoslovak dissent. She knew Havel and his circle. She later was a spokesperson for Civic Forum during the Velvet Revolution, and she brought Václav Klaus into the Civic Forum before later going on to be the Czechoslovak ambassador to Washington. But you say that Martha Dodd was channeling money to Rita Klimova, which the dissent were using in some way. What is your evidence for this?
Only what Dora told me. I'm just piecing it together that I would imagine that March rally she had paid for. That's why she wanted Dora to go and check it out and see how it played.
But what does that even mean, though, she paid for the rally? I mean, these people were driven by, morality or hatred of communism. They weren't paid demonstrators.
No, but they probably needed money for PA systems and logistics. And she had Swiss bank accounts. And she had a lawyer who's still around who probably arranged payments to them. I imagine that was how it was done. He probably also told the STB about it. You know how it is.
By this time, her husband, Alfred Stern, had died. He died in the mid-'80s, a few years before the Velvet Revolution. But what did the transition of democracy mean in practical terms for the life of Martha Dodd?
It meant almost nothing. She was too old to enjoy it. She was in her 82 in very bad health. What it meant was Rita Klimova was gone, so she didn't have any connection to the dissidents at all at that point. She didn't really know anybody, and what it meant was that people were coming to her door wanting interviews, and she was too old and tired to give them. She didn't want to talk to them anymore.
Well, you say in Traitor's Odyssey that you have reason to believe that the former STB officers assigned to watch Martha Dodd before the revolution were ultimately responsible for her death in August 1990.
That is correct. Again, this is from Dora Slaba. The chauffeur's name was naturally Honza. He was a bit of a man of the world who kind of spoke English, and he obviously had a close friendly relationship with the STB guys guarding the house. Would slip them cartons of Camel cigarettes when he'd go up to the border to do shopping. But she ran into him about a year or two after the revolution. And he told her, it's too bad about the old lady, huh? And she goes, yeah, too bad. And he asked, you want to know what really happened? And he said, he told her that the boys, the STB guys guarding the house, got it into their heads that Martha had gold. At this point, they'd been dismissed because the STB had been disbanded, so they were out of jobs. They believed that Martha had gold, which she actually probably did not have. And they broke in one night and tied her up, demanded she give them the gold. She told them she didn't have any. They left her on the floor, stole what they could, which is probably some paintings. She had a lot of art. And they left her there, and she was found the next morning by the cook or the housekeeper and taken to the hospital, and she never recovered. She died a day or two later. So yes, that was entirely based on what Dora told me.
Brendan, you obviously did a huge amount of research in preparing and writing the book. What is your ultimate impression of this woman, Martha Dodd? Do you have any sympathy for her? Do you think she was a bit of a monster?
She wasn't a monster. I don't have much sympathy for her, but yeah, Martha was guilty as you could be. For somebody as guilty as she was, she hadn't really done much. She had a sense of herself, of her own importance, that just is off the charts. I find very little sympathetic about her. The fact that she was a writer and she wanted to be famous. She was one of the original fame whores, to tell you the truth. But she was a lightweight. She thought she was so important. It's hard to believe that, like, you could work for the KGB and have such an opinion of yourself.
It's such a great story in Traitor's Odyssey. You could make a good series or a movie. Is there any chance of anything like that happening?
I hope so. Hey, interestingly, Tom Hanks bought the rights to In the Garden of Beasts, which was also about Martha and her husband. It was about their time in Berlin. It's a great book. I would recommend it to anybody, but he very pointedly left out the fact of her recruitment of the KGB. That part, he put a very tiny little fig leaf on it. He hinted in one sentence that she was accused of espionage. But her life would make a great movie for all kinds of strange reasons. You know, a very shaggy dog that she went decades and didn't do anything. She was the only person who was in World War II and didn't do a single thing. I'm sure I've got the producers just salivating already.
Many thanks indeed to Brendan McNally for that interview, and Traitor's Odyssey, which came out last year on the Icon Books imprint, really is a cracking read. If you're new to Prague Talk and enjoyed our chat, why not look up some of the earlier conversations in the series and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Prague Talk is a Radio Prague production. I'm Ian Willoughby. Thank you so much indeed for listening, and talk to you again very soon.